Hello, Professor and class. My name is Eric Brown, and as some of you may already know, I am an American Sign Language interpreter. When I was looking at our class assignment for a professional presentation, I read that we had to present on either our profession or our desired profession. At first, I thought I would discuss the history of interpreting in the United States, talking about the Registry of Interpreting for the Deaf, how certification was established and the testing that goes into that, and the differences between qualified or unqualified interpreters, also interpreter training programs and their history. But as I began to put my presentation together, I realized that I wanted to start a little bit more basic at where my roots were. And I wanted to talk about what first brought interest into the American Sign Language field of interpreting, and that was the language itself. Growing up in church, we went to many revivals or different Christian concerts, and I would see interpreters signing and interpreting songs, and I just fell in love with the beauty of the language. So at 8 years of age, I borrowed a book from our church library and began to teach myself sign language. I would learn songs and interpret those for my church, and just had a great time learning a new language, and it caught on to it very, very quickly. The older I got, the more interested and the more I learned of sign language, and I began to work as an interpreter for local churches. I would do revivals and had a smaller little deaf community that I enjoyed working with and getting to know. So today I want to do a small presentation on just the history of the beauty of sign language in the United States. Now, as you may have noticed when I first introduced myself, I said that I am an American Sign Language interpreter. Often, when I tell people that I'm an interpreter, I'm asked, is sign language a universal language? And my answer is always the same, and that's not any more than spoken language. Each country has its own sign language. Ours, American Sign Language, happens to be closely related to French Sign Language, and that's due to the history and how American Sign Language was established and brought to the United States. In the early 1800s, there were only a few thousand deaf people in the United States. And because so many of those communities were so far spread apart, there was not an established formalized form of sign language in the United States. Each community or each home had its own version of sign, known as Old Sign Language, and how they could communicate with each other. But if one community met with another, they were likely not able to even understand each other because the language was not formalized, such as English or French. Well, what happened in 1814, Dr. Thomas Gallaudet, who was a minister, lived in Hartford, Connecticut. And this is a photo of Dr. Gallaudet. He had a neighbor by the name of Mason Fitch Cogswell. Mason had a daughter who at the time was 9 years old, and her name was Alice Cogswell. Alice was deaf, and by being neighbors, Thomas had a lot of interaction with Alice, and he began to realize just what an intelligent girl this was. However, she was unable to read or write. Gallaudet realized that this was sad and it was a waste. Because of how intelligent Alice was, he knew she could be successful if she was only taught. However, at the time, there was no technique or formalized way of teaching or educating deaf within the United States. So Gallaudet sought out to remedy this problem. Europe had a long history of a very successful educational process for the deaf members in their community. And Gallaudet knew that in order for him to bring education and information to the deaf here, he would have to travel to Europe and learn their techniques. So through community funding and support, Gallaudet made his way to Europe. When he arrived there, though, he realized that his task was not going to be as easy as intended. Because this technique was so private, and because so many people wanted deaf members to come to their school, they were very secretive on their techniques. And unfortunately, many people had nothing to do with Gallaudet, wouldn't teach him, wouldn't educate him, wouldn't even meet with him. Fortunately, though, he did, while in Europe, meet with 3 men by the name of Abbe Sicard, Jean Massieu and Laurent Clerc. Here is a photo of Laurent Clerc. Laurent Clerc was a successor and a student of Abbé de la Paix and Abbé Sicard, who worked and founded the National Institute for Deaf Mutes. Laurent Clerc and Jean Massieu were students of Sicard's, and they became deaf educators themselves. Gallaudet studied the teaching methods that these men had developed and began to learn techniques and processes on how to work with deaf individuals and educate and teach them. When Gallaudet decided that he wanted to go back to the United States, he knew he would need some help. So he talked to Laurent Clerc and convinced Laurent Clerc to return with him to the United States to help found the schools. On their way back, Gallaudet began to learn all that he could about sign language, French Sign Language at the time, and techniques and processes of how, when he arrived in the United States, he would begin to develop his own techniques and teaching the deaf here. When they arrived, Laurent Clerc and Sicard, who were the best instructors that Gallaudet knew, they founded the school known as the American School for the Deaf, and that was established in Hartford, Connecticut in 1817, and the first public free school for the deaf in the U.S. was established. Obviously, this was a huge milestone for deaf history. The school grew quickly, and deaf members from all across the United States traveled to Hartford, Connecticut to go to school, to be educated, to learn. As I had mentioned earlier, each of these communities spread throughout the United States had their own sign language. So as they all began to congregate at Hartford at the school, the language began to change. The language began to mold. So signs from here and signs from here and signs from here began to merge and mix with the formalized sign language from Laurent Clerc, a French sign language. And the history and the language and the establishment of a formalized language for the deaf in the United States began. In 1863, just a few short years after Gallaudet arrived back in the United States, 22 deaf schools established and set up throughout the United States, and many of those were from Clerc students. They continued to use Clerc's deaf education methods in these schools and use a modified version of those even today. When Thomas Gallaudet died in 1851, his youngest son, Edward Minor Gallaudet, continued his legacy in deaf education. Edward became a teacher at the American School for the Deaf in Hartford, as Edward always wanted to establish a deaf school, and in 1857, Edward was asked to be the superintendent at the Columbia Institute for the Deaf and Dumb and Blind in Washington, D.C. Edward presented his idea for a deaf college to the Congress, and in 1864 legislation was passed permitting the Columbia Institute to issue college degrees. In 1864, the Columbia Institute College Division, known as the National Deaf Mute College, opened. This was the first college for the deaf, and in 1893 the college was renamed Gallaudet University. And here's a picture of Gallaudet University. Gallaudet became, in 1986, was renamed Gallaudet University. And Gallaudet University is now known today for being the first and only deaf university in the world. And it's also in Washington, D.C. Though the language itself began and started back in 1800s, unfortunately, it wasn't until the late or mid-1960s that ASL, American Sign Language, was considered a formalized language. And that was because of the results of William Stockholm, who did a linguistic study on ASL that was published in 1860. Since the history of the history of American Sign Language throughout the United States, it has grown and it has changed. So, though it's related to French Sign Language, similar to English has its roots in Latin, the languages aren't really understood by each other anymore. There is a sign language known as Universal Sign Language or International Sign Language, but that's not really well known. Some can sign it, but it's not considered really a universal language. It's most popular. As sign language became prevalent and as more and more deaf members became throughout the United States, there became a need for interpreters. At first, interpreters were children of deaf adults who had hearing children, clergy members, friends, members in the community who had a basic understanding of sign language but didn't really know the interpreting process itself and would just kind of help out. However, later, a group of educators, deaf educators, came together and realized that there was a lacking in the field of interpreters. And they wanted to provide a registry or a list of interpreters that were in each community that could be contacted to provide work and interpreting as a field and as a profession. And the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf was founded. At first, this was simply nothing more than just a registry of interpreters for the deaf. All you had to do, you had a little card that you would go and have 3 deaf friends or family members sign off saying, yes, this person can interpret. You mailed that in, you got added to the list, and voila, you're an interpreter. However, this was not always the best process. So the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf realized that they needed to find or establish some sort of formalized certification testing process. And the certification, or RID or NIC certification, began to be established. There's a written test that makes sure you know the laws and the codes of ethics that follow the profession. There's testing based on interpreting from a voice into sign language or from seeing sign language and then voicing it appropriately. And there are thousands of registered interpreters and certified interpreters throughout the United States itself. As this began to develop and the requirement and the recognition that qualified interpreters were needed, there became a program or a development of a program called the Interpreter Training Program. And many colleges and universities throughout the United States have had this formalized training where not only are the students learning the sign language and learning the language itself, but they are learning the process of interpreting. They are learning techniques. They are learning how to linguistically take one language and put it into another while still keeping with the same spirit and the same intent of that message. I went through an interpreting program. In fact, I went through 2. I went through one when I lived in Eastern Kentucky, and then I went through one here in San Diego at Mesa Community College. Now, that is why I'm here at Siena Heights University to finish up my 4-year degree as a sign language interpreter. Fortunately, RID, Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, is beginning to grow and is continuing to grow and demanding more and more of their interpreters. So at this point, interpreters are required to have a bachelor's degree, have to have some form of formalized training in sign language interpreting, and then they have to take and pass first a written test and then what we call a performance test, which is just signing or voicing based on what is presented towards you. The field is beautiful. I love every minute of it. The language is far more beautiful than I think even the profession. And the community itself is welcoming, enriching, and I've always felt invited and welcomed. Though I've been signing since, like I said, I was the age of 8 years old, I would by no means consider myself a native signer, and I'm constantly learning and constantly growing and fascinated by all the nuances and just how a lift of the eyebrow can change the meaning altogether, or how a sign just simply changed, or the body language, how important and how connected that is to the message itself. That's why when we do these readings and we do our chapter studies on nonverbal communication, I am just fascinated by it, how just clicking up the lip or gazing in your eye, just slight little movements of the body and of the face change so much of the meaning. So this is just a brief history of the beauty of American Sign Language and how it was first brought to the United States and how it's grown and developed in such a fascinating language that is now getting a lot of notoriety and more people are beginning to learn it. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I hope maybe it sparked a little interest in you as well to possibly learn this language. Thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great day.